Okay, I think we're ready to go for our next session. We are going to be talking about sleep deprivation next. So I imagine a lot of you here suffer with sleep. I know I certainly am at the moment, so I'm looking forward to this talk. And not getting enough rest does have a huge impact on the rest of our day and managing other symptoms related to menopause. So that's why we've invited sleep experts, Dr. Zoe Schaedel, a GP and menopause specialist, and Maja, a clinical psychologist and sleep specialist, to help you work out how to get a good night's sleep. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Come and join us up here, and please do share all of your tips. And if anyone struggles with the sound, then do use the headphones.
Am I in the way? No.
And you'll get a better reception. And if you've got any questions at the end, raise your hand and we'll try to get to them.
Great. Thank you so much for coming to have a little listen to our talk on sleep. So my name is Zoe Schaedel. Thank you for your kind introduction. My background is as a GP and a menopause specialist, and I've always had a really long special interest in sleep.
And I'm Dr. Maja Schaedel. I'm a clinical psychologist and a sleep specialist, and I work at Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust in the Sleep Disorder Centre there. And I also run the Good Sleep Clinic, which is the clinic that Zoe and I set up together to try to help people with insomnia and other sleep difficulties.
So what we're going to talk to you about today is why sleep is important. Why have we spent so much time kind of building our clinic and trying to talk and help people with their sleep? What goes wrong with sleep, particularly in the menopause transition, and what you can do about it. We're talking through what we call a four-step sleep reset. So some things you can do, particularly in the perimenopause, that we think are going to be really helpful to get things better. So when we see people in the Good Sleep Clinic who are struggling with their sleep and they're in the perimenopause, there's certain things that they will say. And what we find is that when sleep goes wrong, everything else, all the other menopause symptoms are much harder to deal with. So these are just some of the things that women say to us. So when sleep goes wrong in perimenopause, it makes everything worse. Lack of sleep just tips the balance. So you might just be able to cope with other menopause symptoms, but when you lose your sleep as well, it just becomes harder. And what we hear a lot is that the tiredness and the exhaustion from not sleeping in the perimenopause is a different level. People say they are bone tired. They are so tired that they just can't manage that very easily. And I just want to tell you about some of the reasons we think sleep is so important. And we've all had bad night's sleep. We know how it makes us feel, but it's not just how we feel. So there's a few things about the way sleep helps our body function. And in particular, we all know that women tend to gain weight through the menopause transition. And we know that metabolism changes. And we think that sleep has a big part to play in that. So that we know when you're not sleeping, your body thinks it's kind of under threat. It feels as though it's kind of fighting for survival in some way. And that means it is trying to hold on to its energy, to weight, to fat. And so we know that if you sleep less than 6 hours a night, you're more likely to consume, on average, 300 extra calories the next day. And over time, that can really add up. And I think that's a big part of weight gain during the menopause transition. We also know that if you haven't slept well, the next day, when these extra calories you consume, they're not likely to be from lettuce. You're more likely to pick foods that are high in sugar and high in fat. And again, it's from an evolutionary perspective. Our body is trying to get itself up to survive, to be able to perhaps do some time when it's not getting much nutrition. So it really bumps up your desire for unhealthy foods. And it also affects our impulse control. So you're more likely to make unhealthy choices. And all of this happens if we're not sleeping well enough. And we also know that actually, if you want to lose weight, it's harder if you're not sleeping. Your body will hold on to fat. So we think it's so important if you're wanting to feel healthier and lose some weight, focus on your sleep first.
So for a long time, we've known that there's a really big correlation between sleep problems and mental health problems. And in the past, if you'd gone to your GP with sleep problems, they may have given you antidepressants or given you treatment for depression. But what we're realizing now is it's a bi-directional relationship. So sure, if you're depressed or anxious, that can certainly disrupt your sleep. But we're also realizing it works the other way round now. And there's more and more research which is showing that if you have sleep problems, this can make you anxious, which I think is really interesting when we think that one of the biggest issues in the perimenopause is the rise in anxiety. So we've got to think, what's the relationship there? Is it that the sleep problems comes first, or is it the anxiety comes first? And in a way, it might not be important what comes first, but we know that there's a relationship between the two and one affects the other. And how that works is that we might have an experience of feeling anxiety. And that anxiety will push up what we call hyperarousal. And that's a whole load of physiological symptoms. Things like our heart rate going up and our core body temperature going up, our muscles become tense, and our breathing quickens. And this is all part of the fight, flight, freeze response, which you might have heard of. This is part of our autonomic nervous system. It's the response to threat or danger. So if you're a cave person, you would have needed this response if you saw a saber-toothed tiger coming your way. But now, in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. when you're waking up, we do not need to be able to respond really, really quickly to threat and danger in this way, but we still get the physiological response. Now, as soon as you get that physiological response, it puts you into a position where your mind then starts to become wired. You start to think, oh no, I can't sleep, this is going to affect my day tomorrow, I'm never going to get rid of this problem, I'm going to be exhausted. And so we get into this vicious cycle between our hyperarousal, or the physiological symptoms of anxiety, and our thought processes. Now that leads to a period of insomnia where you can't either go to sleep or stay asleep. Now, if you're going to have a long period of insomnia, that leads to you becoming tired. That can impact on your emotion regulation. And so we get into this big, vicious cycle between not sleeping, feeling more anxious, our thoughts starting to be catastrophic. In the middle of the night, we start to get really, really worried. And we end up in this kind of big physiological and cognitive behavioural cycle.
The other thing that I think is so important for people in the perimenopause and menopause is their memory. So we know that brain fog is one of the most important symptoms for people. And if you don't sleep at any time of life, it can affect your memory the next day. And we know that particularly deep sleep, it's really important to preparing your brain for learning the next day. And then the following day after learning something, for storing those memories in our in the other parts of the brain, the cortex, which is where we hold on to memories. And we know that when we are a bit sleep deprived, we just can't do that as well. So it increases symptoms of brain fog. And again, when we're thinking about things like brain fog, we've got to look at sleep first and see if we can get that better, because that often does help. We also know a little bit about how sleep impacts on our memory over the longer term. So when we're in our deep sleep, our brain is doing lots of washing away of proteins. And some of these proteins, if they build up over time, they can predispose us to dementia over the longer term. So it's another reason we really want to focus on getting good, healthy sleep.
So we thought it would be good to talk to you about a case study, someone that we've worked with who really struggled with their sleep. So I'm just going to talk you through this person who we worked with, Marianne, and she was 48, and she came to us and she'd had a really significant period of insomnia. So Marianne had had about 6 months where her sleep had gone right down to just 4 or 5 hours a night. And once you get down to that amount of sleep a night, it can really affect how you're feeling the next day, as you can imagine. So what was happening is she was waking at 1 a.m. and she couldn't get back to sleep, and she started panicking in the night. And that was happening most nights. She would feel exhausted in the day. And so how she would cope with it is that she would essentially fall asleep on the sofa in the evenings. She'd just collapse. She'd watch a bit of TV, and all of a sudden she'd kind of zonked out on the sofa. She also found that she was drinking a bit more wine in order to help her to go to sleep. So we know that wine is a sedative, and it does help for people to fall asleep. But we also know that it can disrupt our sleep. So wine is actually, it suppresses our REM sleep, the sleep that we need for our emotional regulation. And it also makes our sleep more fractious. So she was waking up during the night after having some wine to try and get to sleep. She'd had some sleep difficulties in the past. They'd been on and off, but generally they were kind of under control. She had a busy lifestyle. She had quite a bit of work stress. She's had teenagers. She had elderly parents. She was managing a lot. But she also thought of herself as someone that had always managed quite a lot. And so she was saying, why is it now such a problem? So we realised that Marianne, and through assessment with Zoe, had a full menopause assessment, she had other symptoms that were associated with the menopause. So she had increased anxiety. She was also needing to go to the loo twice at night, and that was disrupting her sleep. She was having to get up out of her bed, go to the loo. She didn't actually say about night sweat, so she didn't describe feeling hot at night. Now, that is one thing that we do see quite a lot, especially with the early morning wakenings at sort of 3 a.m. They can often be associated with an increase in that heat that you feel in the middle of the night. She did also say that her periods had changed and she'd had some symptoms related to that. And she had a history of breast cancer. And I suppose this is one of the things when we have to think about what treatment is right for someone going through insomnia. Because we know that some people, if they've had a history of breast cancer, that they might want to be thinking about HRT in a slightly different way. And she'd already tried to do lots of different things to try and reduce her stress. So she'd done some exercise, she'd tried to do some sleep hygiene. And would say generally, when people come to us at the Good Sleep Clinic, they've usually tried everything for their sleep. So these are people who've, given up alcohol back in, 2015. They're people are not drinking any caffeine. They might have blackout blinds. They have the lavender spray. They've done it all. And yet sleep hygiene doesn't have any evidence for working with insomnia on its own.
So here we're going to tell you about some ideas that we use with Marianne, and we think that they're things that often help. So everybody's a bit different, but we think these are things that are really commonly useful. So the first step is to identify what are your sleep triggers. So what's actually set this sleep problem off? The second step is to break the habit. So sleep problems so often become a habit. People just get stuck with them. The third step is to try and dampen down what Maja was talking about, the fight, flight, freeze response, this stress response, the stress state that our body goes into. And the fourth step is to moderate things that are going to disrupt our sleep. And just to say, we also believe it's not about having the perfect sleep lifestyle. You can read 1,000 sleep tips, you can do everything, and it still doesn't work. And it's about finding what works for you and trying to make that what helps you. So just to start with, Marianne is not uncommon. 40 to 60% of women in the perimenopause or menopause will experience a sleep problem. And what we see is a reduction in the amount of sleep and also a reduction in the quality of sleep. So like Marianne, it's shorter sleep, but it's also really fragmented. She wakes a lot through the night, and that's what commonly happens. It's also a time when there are other sleep disorders might happen, so it's really important not just to put up with poor sleep, actually seek some help and make sure there's not something like sleep apnea, which is a breathing disorder overnight, and also restless leg syndrome, when you really want to move your legs around at the beginning of the night, because these can be really problematic. And like with Marianne, you have to think, what symptoms are going on that might actually be disrupting my sleep? And I think going through a symptom checker, talking to a doctor about it, and really saying, am I waking up through night sweats? It's interesting. Often the body temperature changes without us knowing. So we might wake and we might think we haven't had a night sweat, but studies will show actually there has been a change to our core body temperature very commonly. Is it anxiety? As Maja said, anxiety is so common, and anxiety can trigger sleep problems. And again, we can get in that vicious cycle. And depression in the same way. Are you waking up loads of time in the night because you need to pass urine? And if you are, there might be some things we can do about that, and we need to treat that. Even if you haven't got any other symptoms of the menopause, it can just be the background hormone changes. So we know estrogen and progesterone both affect sleep centres in the brain. And actually, it might just be that. This could be the first symptom of the perimenopause. It could be the only symptom that you're experiencing. And actually, it's the hormone changes that make the difference. And it's also worth saying that, like everything, when we age, sleep gets a bit worse, okay? So our sleep, how we generate sleep in our brain, ages. And so over time, it's natural to sleep a little bit less and for our body clock to get a little bit earlier. So there's something about being aware of that as well. You can't fight it all. But stress. So we see stress so often. This is a group of women who are struggling often with huge amounts of responsibility, a lot going on. And stress can really impact on sleep in that same way that it kind of it builds that fight, flight, freeze response. So when we've identified what might be going on, we want to try and offer treatment. So that's where at Myla Health, I would go through these symptoms and see what options there might be. Now, it might be HRT, and we've got to remember Marianne had breast cancer. She might not feel that's an option for her, and we need to go through that. But if you are going to choose HRT, and this follows on really well from Liz's talk just before, using a micronized progesterone can be really helpful. So more than half of women, if they have micronized progesterone as the endometrial protection part of HRT, that will help with their sleep. Not for everybody. Also think about using vaginal estrogen if there is getting up to pass urine in the middle of the night, because that can help with those symptoms. Think of bladder health. So think about, are you actually cutting down your fluids before you go to bed? So lots of people, women, are rushing around all the day and they barely drink. And actually they have all their fluids in the evening before bed. So let's try and bring that a little bit earlier. Think about avoiding things that irritate the bladder, things like caffeine, acidic juices, that type of thing. And then also, we've got to remember Marianne had breast cancer, and there are lots of non-hormonal treatments that can help with sleep. So these might be low-dose antidepressants. Some of them are particularly good for sleep, but there are also other options out there that we need to discuss. And if you're over 55, actually melatonin isn't a licensed option for short-term use because our pineal gland that produces our own melatonin starts to age, the production gets a bit slower. So these are all things to be considered.
So thinking about sleep and what goes wrong with sleep, we need to think about breaking the poor sleep habits. Now, one of the biggest issues, we might have identified the triggers to poor sleep, but what keeps our sleep problem going is often habitual. So you may have already treated the symptoms. You may have actually been taking the HRT. You may have got all your symptoms under control with all sorts of other management techniques, but you're still stuck with the sleep problem. And that's something we see quite a lot at the Good Sleep Clinic. And it's partly because poor sleep becomes habitual. It becomes part of how we learn how to cope with waking up in the middle of the night. So we are humans, we are learning machines. We develop habits really, really quickly, good habits and bad habits. So say for a week you've had a period of stress and you've been waking up in the early hours of the morning. Even when that stress has gone and you've managed that stress and it's gone away and you're feeling all good in yourself, the following week you might still wake up at 3 a.m. because your body has learned this is the time I wake up. So it becomes habituated. So we need to somehow break that new habit that you've formed, which is about waking up in the middle of the night or struggling to go to sleep at the beginning of the night. So we need to think, sometimes people say to us, I just can't, there's no way I can break that. That's just something that happens now. And I think it's really important to say we really can retrain our body and our brain, but it takes some breaking. And one of the ways that we do that is from the cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBTI. Now cognitive behavioral therapy is a type of therapy where you're addressing the kinds of thoughts that get in the way of sleep, such as, I'm never going to sleep, I'm going to feel exhausted tomorrow, I'm going to feel terrible. And that is what keeps you then awake, as well as the behavioural side. So actually our actions, what we do. So another thing that we can do that gets in the way of sleep at night is we can lie in bed for hours and hours, stressing, tossing and turning. And that in itself can actually prolong our sleep problem and make it worse. So we need to think, how do we address those sleep habits? How do we break them? And I think that an example of one of the things we might do is we might think, what do you do in the middle of the night when you wake up? If you're lying in bed hoping to go back to sleep, then maybe we need to think about doing something different. So one technique that we use is if you're not back to sleep within 15 to 20 minutes, you might get up, go into another room, do something relaxing, bring your hyperarousal down, and then go back to your bedroom when you're feeling a little bit more relaxed. And that's really the key point here, is that you can't go to sleep if your hyperarousal is up. It's like, why would you go to sleep if you had a sense of threat or danger around you? And that's what your body is saying, essentially. So you need to dampen that fight, flight, freeze response. And one of the ways we can do that is by getting up and going into another room, reading a book for a while, taking your mind off the problem with sleep, and then going back to bed when you're feeling a lot more relaxed.
It sounds ridiculous, but when all you want to do is to go to sleep, one of the things we want you to do is to stop trying. So we want you to stop putting effort into it. So we actually just say, go and do something else, focus on something else, and then your brain can actually sort of tone down that alertness a bit.
So just going back to the fight, flight, freeze response, thinking, how do we dampen down that fight, flight, freeze response? So one of the ways we can do this is by sort of distracting ourselves and taking ourselves away from the stressful situation. You know, more often than not, people say, actually, my bed has now become a place of stress. People start to say, I'm starting to feel anxious about going to bed at like 7 or 8. I'm starting to think, oh no, I'm coming up to bedtime and now I know I'm going to struggle to get to sleep. So we need to retrain ourselves into feeling comfortable in that space. So what do we do? So some of the techniques we might use are things like relaxation techniques. A really, really great one, and you can just Google this, is the progressive muscle relaxing one, or PGM. Now this is where you gradually go through your muscles by squeezing and tensing your muscles. So you might start with your feet, you squeeze and tense them and hold for a few seconds, and then you relax, and you go through gradually through your whole body. And that does a couple of different things. If you're able to relax your body, your mind then follows, because you're saying, okay, my body is feeling relaxed. So your mind starts to say, okay, I can relax now. But also, it just distracts you from actually what your mind is telling you, which is usually a very panicky message, a catastrophic message. And that is the thing that often stops us from going to sleep. Another example of what you can do to try and dampen that fight, flight, freeze response is something like thought diffusion. And I'm going to go and do a little exercise, if we've got time, like leaves on a stream, which is where we identify a thought that comes into our mind, and then we put it on a leaf and let it go down the stream. So we try to engage with our thoughts in a different way. We don't get stuck, because they often hook us. Particular thoughts hook us. And it's really trying to disengage from that.
And moderating our sleep disruptors. So just as Maja said earlier, alcohol can have a really negative effect on our sleep. And it's really interesting. We hear a lot about how screen time is bad for our sleep. And in all the studies, screens can probably affect our sleep quality by about 2%. Where alcohol, even 1 unit for women, can reduce our sleep quality by 10%. 2 units, 24% reduction in sleep quality. So this is something that if you are drinking, particularly if you're drinking a little bit more because you're not sleeping well, it's really worth trying to cut this down. And it's one of the biggest differences that I see in clinic. When people have managed to cut down or cut out their alcohol, it can make a big difference to their sleep quality. And then a bit about food. So there aren't magic foods you can eat that's going to send you straight to sleep, but it's more about timing. So actually, we don't want you to be eating too close to bedtime, because your body isn't meant to be focusing on its digestion. You're meant to leave. That also can cause a little bit of heartburn, that type of thing. So try and leave at least an hour and a half before bedtime when you have your last food. And 3 is to think about stress. So we would love to be able to take away everybody's stress, but recognizing that there are stressful things going on and seeing if there are techniques to help. And again, some of the techniques Maja mentioned, but also things like mindfulness, meditation can also be helpful there. So just really quickly about Marianne. What helped with Marianne was she looked at those poor sleep triggers. She actually identified some of the things, and she was able to use vaginal estrogen, which helped a little bit with getting up to urinate at night time, made her feel a bit more comfortable. She also worked with Maja to break that poor sleep habit. And did you want to say?
Yeah, so in terms of the leaves on a stream, do you think we've got time to do leaves on a stream?
Yeah, let's try it.
Should we do that?
Yeah, so anyway, these are the things that help with Marianne. And essentially, she had a look at all these things. She also didn't have such an early bedtime, so that's something that we didn't mention, but actually making your bedtime a little bit later can be really helpful, because you have a bit more time to boost up that sleep drive. And she cut down the wine she was using, and that really helped. And she did manage to improve her sleep. So it's not a perfect 8 hours that she was hoping for, but actually it was enough for her to feel fine and thrive. So 6 to 7 hours, and she felt better the next day. And I think just before we move on to leaves on a stream, if we've got time, just to really say you don't have to put up with poor sleep. I think it's something people feel they have to live with, but there are lots of things that can help. There are really effective things, and please do seek help with them. And
So there's a few things that you can take away from there. There's some self-help guides. There's ways you can access CBTI. There's a couple of books that are really, really helpful. We just thought it would be helpful for you to just get a sense of what thought diffusion is. So sometimes it feels like a bit of a strange thing. So if you're interested, I'll just do like 30 seconds for you to just get an experience of what that might be like. So if you're happy to, you can shut your eyes or just allow your gaze to go to a fixed spot in the room. And then I'd like you to just visualize a gently flowing stream in front of you with leaves floating along the surface of the water. And just for a moment, take each thought that comes into your mind and place it on a leaf and let the leaf float by. And just do that with each thought that comes into your mind, whether or not that's a nice thought, a difficult thought, a painful thought. Just place it on a leaf and let it float by. And if you have a thought which says something like, this isn't working, or I can't do this, or I'm not sure I'm doing this right, just place those thoughts also on leaves and let them float by. And if your mind starts to hook you in other ways and tries to take you away from this exercise, that's completely normal. Just notice that your mind has done that and gently bring yourself back to the stream. Do that with each thought, whether or not it's a difficult thought, a frustrated thought. And if you struggle to visualize the stream, you can use a memory of a stream that you know, or some gently moving water, whether or not that's a river or the sea. And when you're ready, just start to become more aware of your surroundings and open your eyes and bring yourself back to the room. Sorry, my mic's just come off. So that's just a little snapshot. I'd usually do that over about 10 minutes. And
again, if you can do it in a room like this that's really noisy, you probably can do it absolutely anywhere. So well done for trying that. And that's us. So thank you so much for listening to us today. If you do have any questions, we'll be over there and come and find us for a chat. Okay.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Maja. That was excellent.